Trigger warning. The story includes references to childhood sexual abuse, coercive religious control, and pregnancy as a minor. If you are affected by these topics, please pause now and reach out to the resources linked in the description. You are not alone. I was married when I was 3. They slipped a ring onto a finger that still smelled of crayons and flushed with toddler energy, and the room applauded like it was a solemn miracle. The ring was light enough to ignore at first, heavy enough in memory to become a weight I would spend years learning to lift. That little metal circle became, for everyone around me, a symbol that my life belonged to a story I did not choose. Those first images are bright, but not from sunlight. They are blue, a basement light that was always switched to a cool blue bulb so faces would look softer on camera. We were told the cameras were for posterity, for testimony, for the good of the movement. The footage would go into magazines, into leaflets that traveled far, so even our most private moments were turned into content. I learned very young how a lens could transform you, how it could freeze you into a role and then force you to play it forever. The world I grew up in had rules that read like scripture to us. Obedience first, obedience always. There was a hierarchy of voices that could not be questioned, and rituals that turned ordinary things into levers of power. A leader's quote could justify rationing breakfast. A published photograph could discipline a child for the way she lowered her eyes. We had costumes for certain days, lines to memorize, and ceremonies that marked us as belonging. The ring, more than adornment, was shorthand for that belonging. Lose the ring, the message said, and you risk losing everything else. My mother loved me in the only way she knew how within that system. She pressed my hair when it needed pressing. She read to me with a voice that trembled when the house was quiet, and loud when it needed to be presentable. But she was also bound. Her love arrived wrapped in the movement's logic, and that logic graded the worth of her care. There were moments of gentleness, small stolen breakfasts, a hand smoothing the back of my neck when I cried. But there were also moments when she did what she had been taught, to correct, to insist, to prioritize doctrine over a child's instinct. She was not a simple villain. She was a mother made small by coercion, trading pieces of herself to keep the family whole. That complexity would become a constant ache for me, the need to name harm while holding room in my heart for the woman who, in many ways, tried to protect me with the only tools she had. Control showed up in practical ways: cameras, publications, the way we were photographed with identical dresses and calibrated smiles so the image could be used later as proof of devotion. Food was portioned when the leadership wanted to remind us who could withhold comfort.
And then the urgency accelerated. I was 13 when I decided to leave. I had a knot in my chest for reasons I did not yet have words for. I also had a secret I was not ready to speak aloud in that house. I was pregnant. I say that plainly because this is one place where memory and truth must meet with clarity. I left at 13, and I was pregnant. I remember counting bus tickets like multiplication, each ticket a possibility, each folded bill a tiny map to a different life. The pregnancy was not a detail for shock value. It was gravity. It changed the math of escape. It made secrecy more urgent, planning more careful, and the timeline shorter. Planning an exit from a place that treated travel as spectacle is a study in practical invisibility. You learn to simulate normality. You borrow money from the neighbor who talks a little too much and pays it back a little too late. You hide cash in hollowed books and in the false bottoms of backpacks. You memorize bus schedules the way other children memorize prayers. I learned which buses left at quiet hours, which ticket clerks were sympathetic, which routes hugged borders, and which were watched. I learned to fold my life into a single backpack, 2 dresses that would not show up oddly on a camera, a pair of shoes that could withstand miles, a small rosary I packed without thinking, and a handful of coins. The night before I left, I packed very slowly. I wanted the act of packing to be ordinary, because in the movement, the ordinary was always suspect. My mother kissed my forehead with a tenderness that was both love and compulsion. She did not say the word run or stay. She told me to be careful. She smoothed the collar of my shirt the way she had done when I was 3. There was no secret handshake, no explicit plan exchanged in a whisper. The details had to be inferred, and that was by design. For a long time afterwards, I held that kiss in the most complex part of my heart, a gratitude for the small warmth and a grief for what kept her hands tied. Smuggling myself out was not a single cinematic rope ladder moment. It was an accumulation of small acts. A coach left at dawn with passengers asleep, pockets full of the hum of the engine. The bus was crowded, bodies pressed near mine like the ocean does around a swimmer. I did not sleep. I watched faces, tuned my breathing, learned the cadence of the driver's cough. I carried myself with a stillness I had cultivated for years. Every time the bus stopped at a roadside stand, I held my breath, thinking the moment would reveal me. It did not. We crossed borders not with violence, but with a bureaucratic hum, stamps, lines, shuffling shoes, and then the world seemed to shift. Arriving in Houston was less like triumph and more like a series of incremental shocks. The first thing I bought was ice cream. There is no other way to say it. That ice cream tasted like a small victory.
It was a cone with too much syrup and a way to feel pleasure without surveillance. Then a movie. Dark room, anonymous faces, someone else's popcorn, and for the duration of the film, there were no cameras, no rehearsed lines. I cried quietly in the dark, and then laughed because it had been so long since laughing felt purely mine. From those small reclamations came pragmatics. My first job was ordinary and sacred. I worked nights at a diner, washing dishes and learning the cadence of small talk. It was a place where mistakes were tolerated because they were part of service, not evidence of moral failing. I learned to say my name aloud and answer to it without flinching. Paperwork became a terrain of sovereignty. A bank account with a number, a payroll stub that had my name typed in, a form that had a box checked saying I was independent. Each sheet of paper was a small map to autonomy, and I learned to treat these mundane things like treasure. Language, for me, was both a tool and a balm. I had always spoken with the movement's cadence, but in Houston, I learned different registers, how to ask for help, how to give directions, how to name pain without expecting fate to answer. I joined an English class, then another, and the confidence those classrooms built was discreet and firm. Work taught me schedules and how to keep them. I learned to call a landlord and ask for repairs. I learned that saying no was both possible and respected by some people I met. Therapy arrived later, not as an instant rescue, but as a room where I could practice noticing myself. I found a therapist who listened without turning my memories into spectacle. We paced through years, the way you might walk a long hallway, slow, stopping to look at each painting, trying not to rush. Naming things, coercive control, grooming, trauma bonding, gave me language that separated the abuse from my identity. I started to understand that as a survivor, I had strategies, some adaptive, some harmful, and that I could rework them into tools of freedom. Grounding techniques became basic mechanics of daily survival, breathing exercises, sensory checklists, a small set of gestures to return me to the present. For me, one helpful method was the practice of naming 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. It's simple. It's not magical. It's a way of telling your nervous system that the present is not the past. I also kept a checklist on my phone, a list of numbers, a list of small tasks like open bank account or apply for library card, and ticking those boxes gave me a slow confidence that accumulated into safety. Community eventually became the scaffolding I had been missing. I found survivor groups, women who had come out of high-control religions and who spoke in the same kind of shorthand I recognized. They taught me what vocabulary meant in lived experience.
They offered practical tips that were sometimes as ordinary as where to find a lawyer who understood forced marriages or how to access emergency housing. Advocacy organizations showed me how to take private pain and translate it into public prevention, so other children would not have to learn survival the way I did. One of the hardest learning curves was how to reconcile my love for my mother with the recognition that she had been complicit in sustaining the system. She had been coerced, yes, but she had also enforced rules that hurt me. The truth was not neat. It was a braided rope of love, fear, miseducation, and coercion. I had to name both, the tenderness and the harm. Forgiveness for us was not a simple absolution. It was a deliberate choice to separate justice from reconciliation. I could hold love in my heart for a woman who had done the best she could within a cage, while also saying aloud that the system she served had damaged me. As I rebuilt, I began to write. At first, my journal entries were private lists of grocery items and nightmares. Then they turned into essays, then into pieces people read. Writing became a way to take back the narrative that had been edited by others. When you have been filmed and photographed and made into someone else's exhibit, reclaiming language is a quiet revolution. I wrote about blue basement lights, about the weight of a ring on tiny fingers,
about counting bus tickets. I wrote not to sensationalize, but to clarify. Testimony for me became responsibility. If my story could alert a parent, a social worker, a teacher, then it was not just personal catharsis, it was a public service. Speaking publicly was not an automatic step. At first, it felt like exposing a wound to strangers. Over time and with care, I found that testimony could be controlled. I could choose what to share and what to hold private. I worked with organizations to inform trainings for church leaders and social workers about how rhetoric can be weaponized to justify abuse. I helped create checklists for institutions to audit their power dynamics, who makes the decisions, how transparency is handled, how children's images are used. I learned that policy work could be a form of repair when it reduced the chance that others would endure what I had. I also learned the limits of personal testimony. Hearing my story did not automatically fix systems. Sometimes it filled a space of acknowledgement, and sometimes it was only a first step toward policy. Advocacy can be slow, it can feel bureaucratic, but small wins come. A church that agrees to change its photography policies, a school district that introduces training on coercive control, a shelter that creates a separate intake stream for people coming from high-control religious settings. These incremental gains are not grand, but they are real and they are protective. There were legal questions, inevitably.
Because of the constraints of memory and the complicated nature of long-term institutional control, I cannot promise definitive legal outcomes in every case. My work with lawyers, however, shifted my focus from personal vindication to systemic prevention. I helped craft witness statements in some cases, I worked with organizations to create guidance for prosecutors, and I offered my voice to help shape policy recommendations. Legal redress is important, but it is also messy and often incomplete. That complexity taught me to value a variety of responses: criminal accountability when appropriate, but also institutional reform, support services, and public education. Healing is not a clean arc. There are days that feel like progress and days when an image will catch me off guard. Trauma recovery is not a ladder, but a landscape. Some slopes are gentle, others steep. There have been relapses into fear, and there have been stretches of surprising ease. I do not offer promises of complete restoration overnight. I offer a report of what has worked for me: therapy, community, practical skills, language to name what happened, and small rituals to remind myself I belong to my own life now. Those rituals are not cures. They are acts of self-possession. A morning cup of coffee without someone judging how long you savor it. A bank card in your name. A trip you plan because you are curious, not because a leader commanded it. Over time, I have moved into work that connects my experience with systems change. I have trained service providers on trauma-informed interviewing. I have spoken in workshops for clergy about the dangers of unchecked authority and how religious language can be misused to control. I have collaborated with survivor networks to develop safety planning tools specifically for people leaving high-control religious groups. In these roles, I try to balance the urgency of warning with the care of not vilifying faith itself. My critique is aimed at abusive manipulation of belief, not at faith as a source of solace for many. If you are watching and you recognize a piece of this life, if blue light is a familiar phrase, if the image of a ring on a small finger twists your stomach, I want to tell you some practical things that helped me and that may help others. These are small and not universal, but they are practical. First, document what you can in ways that feel safe. Dates, places, names, and factual notes about instances of coercion or exploitation. This is not about creating a dramatic dossier. It's about making a reliable record that you can turn to later. Second, build a list on your phone of trusted contacts and relevant organizations. For me, a simple checklist with phone numbers and an emergency plan was a lifesaver. Put in numbers like crisis hotlines and a friend's contact who can be reached at any hour. It is not dramatic to prepare. It is practical. Third, learn simple grounding practices and coping tools and find a therapist who understands coercive control if you can. For me, learning to notice the present through breath, through sensory checks, through small tasks, stopped the past from swallowing everything. Therapy helped me translate survival strategies I had learned as a child into tools for adult life. Fourth, look for community. There are networks for survivors of high-control religions. There are local shelters and international organizations that specialize in abuse within faith contexts. You do not have to go it alone. I also want to name resources explicitly, because when you are in crisis, it's harder to know where to look. In the United States, the 988 Lifeline can connect you to immediate mental health support. RAIN,
The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network provides confidential help and resources for survivors of sexual violence. The International Center on Sexual Exploitation, ICSA, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline offer guidance and connections to local services. Please check the description of this video for direct links to these organizations and region-specific equivalents. If you are outside the U.S., many of these organizations can point you to international partners. One thing I want to say clearly: leaving a high-control religious environment often looks messy from the outside. You may keep complicated feelings for caregivers who were coerced. You may stay in touch with some people and cut off others. You may find yourself rebuilding relationships slowly with boundaries. The aim is not to craft a dramatic exit story for others to witness. The aim is to create a life where choice is real, and where your children, should you have them someday, are raised without surveillance. There were practical milestones that, in the moment, felt trivial, but that later strung together into a life. My first night in an apartment that had a functioning stove and no cameras. My first paycheck that was mine to spend. My library card. A passport I applied for on my own. The day I walked into a small church, not as a member of the movement, but as someone looking for a place that honored consent and dignity. These were all pieces of a slow reclamation. There is a tension that remains. The knowledge that the person who taught me to kneel could also sing lullabies, and the knowledge that institutions that offered solace to some had mechanisms of harm for others. That tension taught me to be precise with critique and generous with compassion. I am angry in measured ways, I am tender in measured ways. Both are true, and both are part of a full witness. When I speak now to groups of clergy, to social workers, to law students, I try to focus on what systems can do differently. Churches can adopt transparent policies about children's images. Institutions can put in place independent review processes for complaints. Leaders can be taught accountability rather than absolute authority.
Schools and community organizations can be trained to notice signs of coercive control that might not be visible as physical abuse, but are extremely damaging to agency. These are not grand prescriptions. They are practical steps that reduce the chance another child will be taught to count bus tickets in secret. If my story reaches someone who is ready to help a child, here are signs to watch for. A child who is overly supervised. A child whose private moments are publicly displayed. A child who uses adult phrasing for their feelings. Or a child who is discouraged from making age-appropriate friends. These are not definitive proofs of abuse, but they are flags that merit gentle inquiry and the use of professional reporting channels. For those who have survived and are reaching toward advocacy, know that telling your story is a choice you can control. You can set boundaries. You can choose what to share privately, publicly, and with whom. There is power in choosing the cadence of your testimony. There is power in pairing story with policy. Your experience can inform better practice, and your voice can prevent harm. I tell this story now not because I want to be defined by what happened to me as a child, but because the arc of my life has been changed by that choice I made at 13. Running did not erase the past. It rerouted my life into possibilities I could not have imagined in the basement with the blue light. I pursued language, work, therapy, and community with a resolve that was practical and sometimes stubborn. I also pursued joy. Joy is not a betrayal of pain. It is a form of resistance. If this resonates with you, or if you are looking for concrete help, please check the description for links to curated resources. If you are able, consider subscribing to hear other survivor stories and materials about safety and recovery. Sharing this video may reach someone who cannot ask for help on their own. Survival does not equal flourishing, but it is the necessary first step. I did not arrive at freedom in a single night. I arrived through a long accumulation of choices, both small and decisive. Cutting my hair, packing a bag, counting bus tickets, choosing a therapist, learning how to say no, getting an ice cream that tasted like a tiny reclamation. Today I work so that fewer children will have to learn those lessons the hard way. If you are in immediate danger, please contact your local emergency services now. For confidential support in the U.S., you can call or text 988 for the Lifeline and the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. RAIN's online hotline provides confidential counseling for survivors of sexual violence, and organizations like ICSA can help connect you with specific supports related to faith-based coercion. Links and regional hotlines are in the description of this video.
I hold you in my heart if any part of this story echoes your life.
There is no one correct way to survive, and there is no timetable you must meet for healing. But there is a path forward, and you do not have to walk it alone. Share this story with someone you trust. Check the resources below, and if you can, share your truth in whatever feels safe. For every person who leaves one set of chains, someone else may never have to be chained in the first place. I am Serena. I was married at 3 by ceremony and expectation. I left at 13, pregnant and frightened, clutching bus tickets and a secret like an ember. Over the years, I learned to tend that ember into a small, steady light. I tell this for the child I once was, for the mother she needed, and for the children who hope for a different starting line. If you are listening, know this. You are not the sum of what was done to you. You are the sum of the choices you make now, the communities you build, and the small daily acts that reclaim your life.